Just out of curiosity, how many of you, raise your hand if this is your first G4G? Oh, wow, more than I thought. Well, thank you for coming, because just like you, if it wasn't for Martin Gardner, I wouldn't be here today. So I'm going to get rolling because I get in the flow, I lose all sense of time, but I've reordered things. I'm going to try to get all the new stuff for people who've been here before up front. So, and then we'll go from there, and I do want to leave some time for Martin Gardner Q&A. So most of you know this is Dad, and these are all the different areas that he had a significant impact to the field and the area of all of these. And so growing up with Dad, who was a polymath, throughout my life, depending on different age groups that I was in, I experienced different facets of Dad. Certainly Dad, from my perspective, other than magic, was his skepticism. And if there's anything I can say personality-wise that Dad instilled into me, that is critical thinking and skepticism. But he also wrote other books, science puzzles. You can imagine how fun it was growing up when in the monthly Arrow book orders that you got to do in elementary school, there was the Arrow Book of Brain Teasers by your dad. So it was pretty cool when those books would come in, kids would be walking around having those. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about growing up from my perspective. What do I recollect as the magazines and newspapers that I remember Dad reading? Now, he certainly got others like the Bomb Bugle, the Chesterton Society, but these are more standard trade magazines and things that I recommend, or that I remember. So certainly, of course, I remember Scientific American. But Dad also subscribed to, then it was a weekly newsletter, but very well done, of science news. And I thoroughly enjoyed science, so it was one of those things that when Dad was done, I would get it, albeit I would get the part of the magazine that already had the pages torn out for Dad to put on his note cards. Skeptical Inquirer and Free Inquiry, those are magazines I remember. Discover magazine, yes, because occasionally there would be articles in Discover that would refer to Dad. I think Scott Kim had an article in Discover magazine at one point that he presented some information and cited Dad. Time magazine was Dad's also weekly news magazine. And of course, growing up in Hastings-on-Hudson, we always had the New York Times delivered to the doorstep. But there was another newspaper. It was the Afternoon Herald Tribune that came out of Yonkers, New York. And Dad subscribed to that only for one reason. And if you know about some of Dad's interests, he was interested in codes, ciphers, and secret writing. And Dad liked purely to do it because it had the daily crypto quote. And Dad would sit in the afternoon during cocktail hour, and he would work on that. And that was the only thing he wanted to get. And to the degree that he actually contacted one of the editors at the Herald Tribune and tried to convince them if the local paper person could just deliver him the page with that. He didn't want to read anything else, just that. And the editor realized who he was, but very politely said that couldn't be done. Other cool things that you never knew what would occur is I remember when the Great International Paper Airplane book came out, and that was something that had been sponsored by Scientific American. So once Dad had looked it over, I got to have that book and then try to do different paper airplanes. Growing up in the house, I specifically remember the routine that Dad had. And I always find this so interesting. But if you look, he'd have breakfast, where over coffee he'd read the New York Times. Then right after breakfast, he'd go upstairs to the 3rd floor of our house. We actually had 3 floors and a basement. And the entire 3rd floor was Dad's office and his library. And it had little storage nooks, and back in those storage nooks were other boxes of books or notes or other things. He'd come down for lunch that my mother would make in early afternoon, and immediately after lunch he'd go back up to work. He'd be down 4 o'clock sharp for cocktails and to do that cryptogram. He'd go back up and he'd work until dinner, which was around 5:30 or 6. And after dinner, he'd go back upstairs to work for a couple hours. And typically, I remember him, he'd go to bed maybe 8:30, but he'd have work in with him where he might be proofreading galleys for a Scientific American article or a book or other things. Although I also have memories for his books. Dad and my mother would sit in the living room, and I think Dad would read the text and my mother would be following along looking for corrections and other things. So this is one of the new things that made me think, what might be some of the contemporary things Dad might have been enthralled in? And I decided to pick a few because it goes to the nature of his interests in science and math. And this caught me last year, that there was a hexagonal storm on the planet Saturn. So what are the odds of that occurring, and what sort of mathematics, and I can't remember the term, fluid dynamics had to go in to create a hexagonal storm on Saturn? Obviously, from his interest in Escher, I'm absolutely certain that this would have been on his table, on his desk, where he would be reading up on it and finding out as much as he could to understand this latest discovery of the Einstein tessellation shape. Now, it's more current now with the continuing rise in artificial intelligence. And this did occur before Dad died. But I remember years before the Deep Blue versus Kasparov match that Dad talked about the increasing AI of computers. And I remember remarking that there came a point that when it came to speed chess, computers could beat any of the chess masters. But then he said, but in a typical game, it still hadn't risen to that. So certainly, artificial intelligence and chess would have been something he would be very interested in, because Dad thoroughly enjoyed playing the game of chess when he was growing up. And in fact, he told me at one point when I was still doing, I was doing kids shows and magic kids shows when I was in high school and in the college. And Dad really didn't want me spending time doing kids shows in college. And he uses the example that his first year at University of Chicago, he joined the chess club. And all he really focused on was going to play chess, and he didn't want to have that happen to me. And chess, this isn't as much AI, but I just thought I'd share with you a family heirloom. There are two things that are the most relevant to me with regards to the legacy of Dad and his family. And that is the Escher, and this is the other thing, because this was the family chessboard that I think had been made for my grandfather. And if you look at it, it's just got a little area you can pull out and the chess pieces fit in. My mother used it for gloves. But if you take a different perspective, the top actually swivels out and it reveals a chessboard. And so this is the chessboard and the chess pieces that I learned to play when I was 8 or 9 with Dad, and that's very, very important to me. Another thing that makes me think about artificial intelligence is Dad was part of an exclusive club of science fiction authors and some scientists called the Trapdoor Spiders. And some of the more noted members were Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Lester Del Rey, and Dad. And they would have monthly meetings in New York City where they'd have a guest host, and then the guest host would be grilled, among other things. As an aside, Isaac Asimov wrote a series of short stories, I think called The Black Widowers. And if you Google that, you can find it. It is actually themed on the Trapdoor Spiders, where it kind of goes into some of the things that they did. But I have no doubt that at some point, for example, because of Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, I suspect that the Turing test or discussion came up, because I remember during the AI discussions, numerous points in my life, Dad would always talk about the notion of whether or not you could tell whether a computer or someone typing to you or information was real or AI based on the way that you would question, and fundamentally the simplest version was you would be unable to tell in communication with AI that it was an artificial intelligence. You would believe it to be absolutely just like someone else you knew. So thanks to talking with my good friend and colleague who's out here when I was kind of thinking, well, what else am I going to talk about? Dave Eddyburn in the back. We got to thinking about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. So on a whim, I decided, well, let's ask ChatGPT a couple questions. So for example, and it may be hard to read, and I'm not going to read this out, when I asked, what are the hobbies that Martin Gardner was known to like? Magic, puzzles and recreational math, literature, chess, writing and journalism, and philosophy and critical thinking. That's pretty spot on. I think when I asked who was Martin Gardner, it kind of just recited his Wikipedia page. What are Dad's contributions to recreational math? Books and articles, puzzle books, popularizing math concepts, inspiration to mathematicians and educators, and his legacy. Yeah, that's not bad. That would probably pass for a freshman paper, sort one. Now this is a little more interesting. Who are Martin Gardner's friends? I don't believe this is in an order of best friend to lesser friends, because I can say I'm absolutely certain that James Randi was Dad's best friend. But we have Isaac Asimov, Raymond Smullyan, who used to come to these, and interesting Lewis Carroll scholars. Yeah, okay. Now, who were Martin Gardner's charlatans? I thought enemies would be better. Pseudoscience promoters, creationists, superstition and irrationality. And what pseudoscience did Martin Gardner consider the most false? And it doesn't really talk about any specific thing, although I suspect maybe Dianetics, and then things like dowsing and other quackery would have fit in there, because I remember we talked about those things. There was a whimsical side to Dad, and it started very early on. So this is a copy that I found of the Tower Topics that was written by Dad, or early on he contributed to when he was at the University of Chicago. And he called these things topicos, although for some reason I remember the term droodles is what he liked to use. And topicos were fundamentally illustrations or things that have the least amount of information, but you can deduce it. And he offered, and this is kind of an article talking about Dad, in this one he offered 4 topicos. Now, what does anyone want to suggest what they think one is? One is someone leaning over scrubbing the floor. What do you think number 2 is? Very good, a man in a bathtub. What do you think number 3 is? Yes, 2 submarines crossing each other. Very good. What about number 4? Number 4, what? Oh, I'm sorry, the one up. It's listed as number 4. Number 4 is a soldier and his dog walking by a door. So those were the sort. So Dad also, this is something about 10 years late, I think I'm not sure when this was again. He was asked to do some caricatures about individuals in I think it was his graduating class. This was in the Phoenix. And this is just some of the line drawings that Dad did. That whimsical side to him in terms of his illustrations. This is also one of my favorites when I was early going through his papers. I found this copy of a form letter that Dad would send out to certain individuals who would write him asking for information. And Dad, if you know, Dad was almost meticulous about writing back to people if they gave him a question or they wanted to direct him to something that he thought was informative and interesting. But this form letter apparently was when he just didn't want to reply other than these particular things. And the ones that stand out to me that I really enjoy is number 6, that Martin Gardner regrets that it is impossible for him to make a trip to Manhattan except under extreme provocation. And then put the reader in touch with Dr. Matrix. And time-wise, I can just say Dad's first meeting with Salvador Dali in New York City. After lunch at the end, Dali leaned over to him and asked him if it would be possible that Dad could put him in touch with Dr. Matrix. and Dad said he had to let Dolly down gently regarding that. This was a caricature by Ken Fallon that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. I think it appeared just before Dad died, a few months. And I had already written to Ken Fallon, or maybe it's Fallon, and said, I would like to purchase this. And he had the original, and he very generously let me purchase it for a very reasonable sum. And this is framed in my house. If the winner or winners of the visit to Dad's papers, whoever the winner is, you'll be able to see that up front. And in fact, I popped this in. A previous board member, Robert Crease, had done an article. So you can get the QR code and you can read this article. And the Dad predicted the millionth digit of pi was going to be 5, and he was accurate. But if you ask Dad, he said he purely picked the number out of the air and said that that's what it was going to be. So that was him. Some things in Dad's office. Well, if you were ever visiting his office, he had a very good relationship with Pete Hine. Pete Hine actually visited and stayed at our house on 2 different occasions. Pete Hine's Soma Cube. Dad had this. It's a great illusion. And while it runs, I'll see if I can find a way to power. If you notice I'm going to be optimistic. If you notice, the height of the glass is lower than that piece of white paper. Yes, this is a great barbette. It goes around the top. This was another illusion that he really liked. And if you could see, there's a pig sitting at the top of the dome here. And he often would like people, he'd say, well, why don't you pick up the pig? So it's an illusion with mirrors that bring the image up. And then, depending upon the situation, I call them transitory illusions, because some would come in, Dad would have them for a while, but then he would hand them off to other people. The Thinkley the Dragon, he had that, and you can go get versions of that on the G4G or Celebration of Mind website. These are things I just added this morning, probably because my battery's down. I remember him playing, someone had sent him the LP for the Endless Octave, which was that one that just kept going up and up. And then Carl Mulcahy said the first thing that Dad showed him this illusion, that you can actually take a Coke or a certain type can and it will balance on its side like that if you have a certain amount of stuff in there. These were Dad's use of technology: word processing, rubber cement, and scissors. Dad used only a rotary phone, even though we had touch tone. And when he balanced his checkbook, he used an abacus. Martin Gardner's Rolodex. This was where he had information about different individuals. And how am I doing on time, by the way? I've only got 5 minutes left. Okay. The Rolodex, and I've got here, it's kind of hard to see, but those are index cards. Come up to me. If you see your name on there, I've got that index card, if you're still with us, and I'm happy to give that to you. Martin Gardner's famous favorite TV and radio shows. Dad did not watch TV, but when Randy was on Johnny Carson, he watched it, and so did I. And also The Nature of Things with David Suzuki. And he listened to radio only pretty much to Long John Nebel in New York City, because Nebel would have crackpots on, like people about UFOs and strange occurrences, and he would, in fact, get new information. Well, I'm going to have to go through this pretty quickly. Wall art. I'm going to skip that. Einstein, L. Frank Baum, The Wizard of Oz. Bill Ritchie created this for G4G, and I have the original. That was something, I think, from Discover magazine, and of course, the Ken Knowlton domino, and photos of Dad with the domino. What were in Dad's closets? All his awards. He didn't keep them out. Now, I want to finish with this, and I'm going to hurry. If you remember when I was talking in G4G15, I revealed some things that I want to give an update. I had gotten an email, suspicious email from IM, and it suggested that look at some of the things. Dad lived on Euclid Avenue, and that was his phone number. Well, if you add numbers to the letters for Euclid, you get 67. That's a prime number. If you take our phone number, and you reverse it, that's a prime number. So it really got me thinking that maybe that I'm was Iva Matrix, Dr. Matrix's daughter. And so I got to thinking about some additional things. When Dad first moved to Hendersonville, North Carolina, he moved into a house on Woods End Drive. That's 157. That's a prime number. He then moved to another house. Oh, I'm sorry. Then when he moved to Norman, his address was Canadian Trails Drive, 181. That's a prime number. Dad moved from that address to a different location and had room 216 on the same address, Canadian Trails Drive, 216, 181 plus 216, 397. That's a prime number. And so I went back. Well, Dad lived in a house in Hendersonville, Chestnut Tree Road, and that's not a prime number. So I said, aha. And I reached out to Iva, and she said, oh, no, things aren't always as they appear. You have to think about the number of houses that Dad had and the address. And so I did get to thinking. So he lived at 3001 Chestnut Tree Road, and it was his 6th house. That's a prime number. I can't make this up. So as I'm going to close, because I know we started a little late, surely the best way to wake up a student is to present an intriguing mathematical game, puzzle, magic trick, joke, paradox, model, and limerick. And in fact, I'm wearing the t-shirt that Nancy Blackman designed that says that exact quote.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Round of applause.